The land itself held its breath, baked and weary under a sun that gave no quarter. For Nita, this expanse of cracked earth and skeletal sagebrush was both prison and refuge. It was a place where the ghosts of her past could not follow, for even ghosts needed something to cling to, and this land offered nothing but sharp edges and a lonely wind. She had been cast out from the people, a whisper of a woman bearing a name she no longer spoke, for a crime that was not her own. Survival had become a quiet, grim ritual, a series of tasks performed with the fluid grace of someone who had nothing left to lose but the beat of her own heart. Her shelter was a modest lean-to, patched with hide and hope, tucked into a crease of the unfeeling hills like a secret the earth was reluctant to keep. Life was a rhythm of checking snares, gathering what little the parched soil offered, and watching the horizon, a habit she could not break. She watched for threats, for opportunity, but mostly, she watched out of a loneliness so profound it felt like a second skin. Her days were measured by the sun's slow march across a pitilessly blue sky. The silence was a constant companion, broken only by the cry of a hawk or the rustle of a lizard in the dry grass. She had grown accustomed to the solitude, had even found a sliver of peace within its vast emptiness. It was a sterile peace, devoid of joy or connection, but it was hers. She carried the ache of her exile like a stone in her heart, a constant, dull weight that reminded her of all she had lost, the warmth of the communal fire, the cadence of her mother's voice, the shared laughter with the man whose name was now a forbidden sound, a man whose love had cost her everything. Sometimes, in the deep quiet of the night, she would allow herself to remember his face, the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners when he smiled, a memory so sharp it was a fresh wound every time. That life was a ghost, and she had learned not to feed it. She was alone, but she was alive. The change came as all things did in this land, with violence and without warning. The sky, for weeks a canvas of monotonous blue, began to bruise in the late afternoon. The air grew heavy, thick with an unspoken tension. Nita tasted ozone on the wind and saw the clouds gathering on the horizon, not as soft promises of rain, but as a dark, churning army. This was no gentle summer shower. This was a tempest, a physical manifestation of the world's fury. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that escalated into a shriek, tearing at her lean-to, testing the strength of her careful knots. Dust and grit filled the air, a blinding, choking fog that turned the familiar landscape into a place of nightmares. She hunkered down, her body taut against the assault, listening to the symphony of destruction outside. The storm was a wild thing, a grieving beast, and its sorrow was a terrifying thing to behold. It was during a momentary lull in the wind's screaming that she heard it. A sound so alien in this maelstrom of nature's rage that she thought her mind had finally fractured. It was a cry, thin and reedy, almost consumed by the thunder that followed it. She waited, her heart pounding against her ribs, straining to hear it again. There it was, closer this time, a desperate, terrified wail. It was the sound of a child. For a long moment, she did nothing, trapped between the instinct to survive and a deeper, more ancient instinct to protect. To venture out into the heart of the storm was madness. But to ignore the cry was a betrayal of something fundamental within her, the part of her that had not yet been hardened into stone by grief and isolation. With a question born of a sudden, fierce compassion, she pulled her worn buffalo hide tight around her shoulders and pushed her way out into the raging chaos. The world outside was a churning vortex of wind and rain. The sky was a furious slate gray, split open by jagged veins of lightning. The rain came not in drops but in solid sheets, driven horizontally by the gale. It was a battle to simply stand, to draw breath. Nita leaned into the wind, her eyes slitted, searching the swirling gloom. She followed the sound, a beacon of human misery in the elemental war. And then she saw him. A small figure, no more than 4 or 5 summers old, huddled against a rock, his small body shaking uncontrollably. He was soaked to the bone, his fine, dark hair plastered to his pale face, his clothes no match for the storm's fury. He looked up as she approached, his eyes wide with a terror that pierced Nita's carefully constructed armor of indifference. They were blue eyes, the color of a winter sky, and they were filled with a plea that needed no language. She approached him slowly, her movements calm and deliberate, as if gentling a frightened colt. She knelt before him, the wind tearing at her hair, and offered a hand. He flinched, but did not pull away. His fear was a palpable thing, a cold aura that even the storm could not wash away. She spoke no words, knowing they would be stolen by the wind, knowing that the language of kindness was universal. She simply wrapped a corner of her buffalo hide around his small, trembling shoulders, a gesture of shared warmth in the face of the world's cold fury. He looked at her, his small face, a mask of confusion and exhaustion, and then, with a sob that seemed to tear from the very depths of his being, he leaned into her. Nita gathered him up, his slight weight a shock in her arms, and turned her back to the wind, beginning the arduous journey back to the fragile sanctuary of her shelter. Inside the lean-to, the roar of the storm was muffled, a distant beast clawing at the walls. The small space, usually a symbol of her solitude, now felt like a haven. She carefully set the boy down on her own sleeping pallet of soft furs, her movements gentle and efficient. She worked quickly, stripping away his cold, wet clothes, and wrapping him in the driest skin she possessed. His shivering was violent, his skin icy to the touch. A new kind of fear, sharp and protective, lanced through Nita. This was no longer an abstract cry in the storm, this was a life, fragile and flickering, that had been placed in her hands. She built up the small fire in the center of the shelter, feeding it precious, dry twigs until it blazed with a steady, reassuring warmth. The light danced across the boy's pale features, revealing the fine quality of his now damp shirt and the small leather boots that spoke of a life far removed from her own. He did not speak, he simply watched her with those wide, solemn eyes, tracking her movements as she prepared a thin broth from dried herbs and the last of her smoked rabbit meat. The silence in the small shelter was thick with unspoken questions. Who was he? Where had he come from? But Nita did not ask. She knew that fear had stolen his voice, and that answers were less important than warmth and sustenance right now. She held a small wooden bowl of the warm broth to his lips, and after a moment's hesitation, he began to sip, his small hands clutching the sides of the bowl, as if it were an anchor in a tossing sea. The act of feeding him, of caring for this small, lost creature, stirred something deep within Nita, a feeling she had long believed to be dead. It was a painful, aching tenderness, a maternal instinct that her own history had taught her to suppress. As the hours passed and the storm continued its relentless assault, a fragile truce settled between them. The boy, whose name she did not know, finished his broth and curled into the furs, his exhaustion finally overwhelming his fear. He looked so small, so vulnerable. In his sleep he whimpered, his small hands clenching. Instinctively, Nita began to hum, a low, ancient melody from her childhood, a song meant to soothe and protect. The sound, rough from disuse, filled the small space with a quiet grace. The boy's whimpers subsided, and he settled into a deeper sleep. Watching him, Nita felt the stone in her heart shift just a little. For the first time in years, she was not just a survivor, she was a guardian. Meanwhile, miles away, another soul was being battered by a storm of a different kind. Caleb's world had shrunk to a single agonizing point, the empty bed in his son's room. The sprawling ranch, a testament to a decade of relentless work and shrewd investment, felt like a hollow, mocking monument to his failure. It was a kingdom of wealth and influence, but it was empty, its heart torn out twice. First, when his beloved Sarah had been taken by a fever 2 winters past, and now, with the disappearance of their son, Leo. The grief for his wife was a constant, dull ache, a landscape of sorrow he had learned to navigate. But this new terror for his son was a sharp, jagged thing, a living torment that left no room for breath or reason. He had been in a meeting with his foreman when Leo had slipped away. The boy had been quiet and withdrawn since his mother's death, prone to wandering the vast, lonely spaces of the ranch as if searching for her ghost. The storm had rolled in with shocking speed, and by the time they realized he was gone, the world had become a howling wilderness. Now, Caleb rode at the head of a search party. A grim-faced assembly of ranch hands. Their faces were hard, their eyes narrowed with suspicion. They were good men, loyal to him, but their fear was curdling into something ugly. Whispers had started, rumors of a renegade Cheyenne band seen in the hills. The word savage was a venomous hiss on the wind. "We're wasting time in these hills, Mr. Calloway," his foreman, a burly man named Gus, urged, his voice rough with impatience. He gestured with his chin towards the east. "The reservation. That's where they'll have taken him. We ride in there, we show 'em we mean business. We'll get him back." The implication was clear. A show of force, an interrogation of an entire people for the actions of a phantom few. Caleb reined in his horse, turning to face his foreman. The wind whipped at his face, but his eyes were like chips of ice. "We will do no such thing, Gus," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You will not ride onto that reservation and threaten women and children because you're scared. Leo is my son, my responsibility, and I will not start a war based on your damned superstitions. We searched the foothills. He knows these lands. He would have found cover." Gus stared back, his jaw tight with defiance, but he eventually dropped his gaze and gave a curt, resentful nod. Caleb turned away, the exchange leaving a sour taste in his mouth. He pushed his horse onward, his eyes scanning the ravaged landscape, his heart a cold, hard knot of terror. Every rock looked like a small, huddled body. Every cry of the wind sounded like his son's name. The storm finally broke with the dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and bruised. The air was cool and sharp, the sky a tender, pale blue. In Nita's lean-to, the boy stirred. He sat up, the furs pooling around his small waist, and looked at her. For the first time, a word escaped his lips, a small, tentative question. "Mama?" The word struck Nita with the force of a physical blow. It was a simple, childish mistake, a confusion born of fear and a flicker of kindness in the dark. But for Nita, it was a ghost, a reminder of the future that had been stolen from her, the life she would never have. She felt the old, familiar ache of loss, sharp and piercing. She simply shook her head, a small, sad gesture, and offered him a piece of dried fruit. He took it, his blue eyes still fixed on her, a silent question hanging between them. Nita knew she could not keep him. He belonged to someone, to the world of fine clothes and leather boots. To keep him would be to steal him, and she was a survivor, not a thief. As the sun climbed higher, she took him by the hand and led him out of the shelter. She would take him towards the lowlands, towards the direction of the big ranches, and leave him where he could be found. It was the right thing to do, the only thing to do. But every step was a small act of tearing, a separation from the brief, unexpected warmth that had entered her life. He held her hand tightly, his small fingers a trusting weight in her palm. He did not speak again, but his presence was a constant, silent conversation. Caleb's search had grown more desperate with the rising sun. They had found tracks, small boot prints, washed out and faint, leading away from the ranch and up into the rocky, unforgiving foothills. Hope warred with terror in his chest. He was alive. He had been moving. He had dismounted, leading his horse, his eyes locked on the earth, when he saw it. A thin curl of smoke, almost invisible against the morning sky, rising from a crease in the hills ahead. "There," Gus grunted, pointing. "Squatter's fire." The word squatter was laced with contempt. For the ranch hands, anyone living on this land without a deed was a parasite, a threat. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. It was a long shot, a fool's hope, but it was the only hope he had. "We approach quietly," he commanded, his voice tight. "Gus, you and 2 others circle around back. The rest of you, with me. No shooting unless I give the word. Is that understood?" He received a series of grim nods. The men spread out, their rifles held at the ready, their movements tense and predatory. Caleb felt a cold dread snake up his spine. He was leading a posse, not a rescue party. He prayed he was wrong, prayed that whatever he found, he could control his men. He crept forward, his boots silent on the damp earth. He peered over a rocky outcrop and saw the lean-to. It was a humble, pathetic thing, barely a shelter. And then he saw them. A woman, her back to him, was kneeling on the ground, pointing to a flower that had bloomed after the storm, and beside her, listening intently, was Leo. Relief washed over Caleb so powerfully his knees felt weak. He was alive, he was safe, he was not hurt. The woman was native, her dark hair braided down her back, her clothes worn and patched. She looked up, as if sensing his presence, and her eyes met his. They were dark, wary eyes, full of a history he could not read, but he saw no malice in them, no threat. He only saw a deep, profound stillness. Before Caleb could speak, could call out, Gus and the others broke through the trees, their rifles raised. "Don't move," Gus snarled, his voice a weapon. Nita froze, her body instantly becoming a shield in front of Leo. The boy, startled, let out a cry and scrambled behind her, clinging to her tunic. The sight of his son seeking protection from this stranger, while his own men threatened her, sent a spear of shame through Caleb. "Stand down." Caleb's voice was a roar, a whip-crack of authority that stopped the men in their tracks. He strode forward, into the clearing, his eyes never leaving Nita's. He ignored his men, ignored the rifles, and focused only on the woman who had sheltered his son. He stopped a few feet from her. He saw the fear in her eyes, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, defiant protectiveness. She did not cower. She did not beg. She stood her ground, a silent guardian. "Leo," Caleb said, his voice softer now, cracking with emotion. The boy peeked out from behind Nita's legs. "Papa," he cried, a sob of relief in his voice. He ran forward and flung himself into Caleb's arms. Caleb held him tight, burying his face in his son's hair, the solid, living warmth of him chasing away the last of the icy terror. He held him for a long moment, reassuring himself that he was real, that he was unharmed. Then, still holding his son, he looked at Nita. His men were muttering, their suspicions still thick in the air. "She probably took him, boss," one of them said, "holding him for ransom." Caleb looked from the man's angry, fearful face to Nita's calm, proud one. He looked at the humble shelter, the dying fire, the single piece of fruit left on a clean stone. He saw no evidence of a kidnapper, only of a caregiver. He saw the worn hide that had clearly been wrapped around his son, the small bowl that had held broth. He saw the truth. "She saved him," Caleb said, his voice quiet but absolute. He looked directly at Gus. "She saved his life. We will show our gratitude." The journey back to the ranch was a strange, silent procession. Nita walked beside Caleb's horse, refusing his offer to ride. She moved with a liquid grace, her eyes on the horizon, as if she were already planning her return to the wilderness. Leo, exhausted but safe, rode in front of his father, his head resting against Caleb's chest. The ranch hands followed behind, a confused and sullen pack, their certainty shattered by their employer's strange command. When they arrived at the sprawling ranch house, a magnificent stone and timber structure that seemed to grow out of the land itself, Nita stopped, her gaze taking in its immense size. It was a fortress, a symbol of a world so alien to her own. Caleb dismounted and lifted a sleeping Leo from the saddle. He turned to Nita. "You will stay," he said. It was not a question, nor was it a command. It was a statement of necessity, a plea disguised as a declaration. "You saved my son. I owe you a debt I can never repay, but I can offer you shelter, safety." Nita looked at the grand house, then back at the distant, unforgiving hills that had been her home. She saw the suspicion still lingering in the eyes of the ranch hands. She knew she did not belong here, but then she looked at the sleeping child in Caleb's arms, and she felt the tug of that new, fragile connection. She gave a single, almost perceptible nod. The days that followed were a quiet, awkward dance of two worlds colliding. Nita was given a room, larger than her entire lean-to, filled with soft fabrics and dark, polished wood. It felt like a cage. The house was run by a stern, efficient housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Gable, whose lips were permanently set in a thin line of disapproval. She did not voice her objections, but her silence was a condemnation. One afternoon, Nita was sitting with Leo on the grand porch, showing him how to weave blades of grass into a small circle, when the housekeeper appeared. "The boy has chores to do," Mrs. Gable stated, her voice crisp and cold, ignoring Nita entirely as she addressed only the child. "And you?" she added, her gaze finally falling on Nita like a splash of ice water. "Should not encourage him to play with weeds. We have proper toys." Nita met the woman's hard stare, her own expression unreadable. She did not rise to the bait. "The earth is not a weed, and this is not play," Nita said, her voice soft but firm. "It is a lesson in how to make something from what you are given." Leo looked from one woman to the other, his small face clouded with confusion. Nita simply gave the finished grass ring to him, a small, imperfect circle of green. "Mrs. Zopel." Gable sniffed. a sound of pure contempt, and retreated back into the shadowed house, leaving a chill in the warm afternoon air. Despite the housekeeper's coldness, Leo was Nita's shadow. He followed her everywhere, his small hand often finding its way into hers. He showed her his wooden toys, his picture books, chattering away in a constant stream, filling the vast silent rooms with a life they had not known for years. With him, Nita's reserve melted away. She would tell him stories of the coyote and the eagle, her voice a low, musical murmur that seemed to soothe the very soul of the grieving house. Caleb watched them from a distance, a strange mix of gratitude and turmoil in his heart. He saw the way his son, who had been a ghost in his own home, was slowly coming back to life under Nita's quiet care. He saw the gentleness in her hands, the wisdom in her eyes, and the unshakable dignity with which she navigated the hostility of his own staff. He began to seek her out, not just to thank her, but to be near the quiet strength she possessed. Their conversations were stilted at first, filled with long silences. He would find her in the garden, her fingers tracing the petals of his late wife's roses. "Sarah planted those," he said one afternoon, his voice thick with unshed grief. Nita looked at him, her dark eyes filled with a deep, knowing empathy. "They are beautiful," she said simply. They hold her memory. She did not offer empty platitudes or clumsy words of comfort. She offered understanding, a shared acknowledgement of loss that was more comforting than any words could be. He found himself telling her things he had told no one, not even his closest friends. He spoke of Sarah, of his dreams for the ranch, of the crushing loneliness that had consumed him since her death. And Nita listened, her stillness, a vessel that could hold the weight of his sorrow. In return, she shared fragments of her own story, speaking of her exile not with bitterness, but with a profound, aching sadness. He learned that she had been cast out because she had loved a man from a rival band, a love that had been forbidden, a love that had ended in tragedy and blame. He saw that the fortress he had built to protect his wealth was nothing compared to the fortress she had built around her heart. One evening, as a chill wind whispered outside, they sat before the massive stone fireplace, Leo asleep on the hearth rug between them. The firelight cast flickering shadows on their faces, softening the hard lines of grief and weariness. "This house was just a shell before you came," Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. The silence was deafening. "You and Leo, you've brought its heart back." Nita looked from the sleeping boy to the powerful man beside her, a man who was, in his own way, as lost as she had been. She saw the vulnerability beneath his stoic exterior, the profound goodness that had allowed him to see past his men's prejudice and trust her. "A heart needs a reason to beat," she said softly. "You gave my son a reason to laugh again. I hear him in the mornings now. I had forgotten the sound." He paused, his gaze fixed on the flames. "And you? What makes your heart beat, Nita?" For a long moment she said nothing, the weight of the question settling in the space between them. For a long time nothing did. She finally admitted, her voice a thread of sound. "Only survival. Now, watching him sleep, it is a start." In that quiet moment, something shifted. The space between them, once a chasm of cultural difference and personal pain, was now filled with a fragile, unspoken understanding. It was not a sudden, passionate declaration, but a slow, dawning realization, as gentle and steady as the rising sun. He looked at her, truly saw her, not as an outcast or a savior, but as Nita, a woman of incredible strength and quiet dignity. And she saw him, not as a wealthy rancher, but as Caleb, a man with a wounded heart who was capable of great kindness. The storm that had thrown them together had passed, but it had washed away the old world, leaving the ground fertile for something new to grow. In the quiet warmth of the firelight, surrounded by the ghosts of their pasts, they found the beginning of a new future, a love story written not in grand gestures, but in shared silence, mutual respect, and the unexpected, life-altering discovery of a home in another's heart.